The Vienna Circle: Logic, Science, and the Battle for Truth in a World on the Brink. Introduction. The vibrant air of Vienna. Vienna in the early decades of the 20th century was a city of contrasts, an imperial capital with a grand past, but also a hotbed of modernist movements, new art, radical politics, psychoanalysis, and innovative philosophy. Sigmund Freud was revolutionizing the understanding of the human psyche. Gustav Klimt and Egon Schiele were painting in bold strokes. Arnold Schoenberg was exploding musical conventions. And in a few seminar rooms in the University of Vienna, a group of philosophers, scientists, and mathematicians were challenging the nature of knowledge itself. Historians often depict the early 20th century as a time torn between the old imperial order and the transformations wrought by science, technology, and the Great War, 1914 to 1918. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolved after World War I, leaving Austria in a state of political and cultural redefinition. In that swirl of uncertainty emerged a new impetus for clarity and reason, a quest to rebuild the foundations of knowledge on something secure. Enter a circle of intellectuals determined to recast philosophy in a scientific mold, discarding centuries of metaphysical speculation in favor of logic, empirical methods, and the gleaming new formalisms of mathematics. This was the Vienna Circle, Wiener Kreis. Although its formal gatherings occurred mainly from the mid-1920s until the mid-1930s, the currents feeding into this group had their origins earlier. Its core figure was Moritz Schlick, whose calm and professorial demeanor belied a fierce dedication to the new scientific philosophy. Around him gravitated men like Rudolf Carnap, Otto Neurath, Hans Hahn, Herbert Feigl, Philipp Frank, and many others. They shared not only an interest in science but a suspicion of metaphysics, which to them amounted to baseless speculation. Across the fields of physics, mathematics, logic, sociology, and beyond, they aimed to unify scientific knowledge and shape the course of modern philosophy. In telling their story, we will delve not only into their unity of purpose, but also their disagreements, the tensions and rivalries that shaped their debates, and the fateful historical events that scattered them across Europe and America. In the process, we will see how they altered the philosophical landscape, launching what came to be known as logical positivism or logical empiricism, and setting the stage for much of 20th century analytic philosophy. To make this narrative more immersive, we will eavesdrop on imagined but plausibly motivated conversations in lecture halls, coffeehouses, and private apartments around Vienna. By recreating the emotional climate and intellectual sparks of their discussions, the hope is to convey not only the content of their theories, but the human drama of their pursuit. Note to the reader, the dialogues below, while inspired by historical sources and recollections, are fictional dramatizations intended to convey the spirit of the Vienna Circle's meetings. Direct quotes from published writings are paraphrased or contextualized. All attempts have been made to preserve the philosophical stances and personalities in a manner consistent with historical evidence. Chapter 1. Seeds of a Scientific Philosophy. The story of the Vienna Circle does not begin in 1924 or 1929 or 1933, though those are the dates often cited for particular events or manifestos. Rather, it begins in the intellectual lineage of Ernst Mach, 1838 to 1916. An Austrian physicist and philosopher whose influence loomed large over the group. Mach's empirio-criticism insisted that science be grounded in experience alone, that all concepts must be tied to sensory data, and that metaphysical notions were basically meaningless ornaments. His stance resonated powerfully with a new generation of scientists and philosophers shaped by Einstein's relativity, quantum theory, and a sense that knowledge must be anchored to empirical verification. During the late 19th century, Mach was known for his contributions to the physics of shock waves, think Mach speed, and for his philosophical inquiries into how the mind organizes sense impressions. Mach was critical of Newtonian absolutes of space and time, a stance that dovetailed with Einstein's later revolution. For Mach, the concepts of absolute space or absolute time were not derived from direct experience. They were metaphysical posits that good science ought to avoid. Mach taught for many years at the University of Vienna, and a younger generation of scientifically oriented philosophers took up his call for an empirical criterion of meaning. One might say Mach laid the foundations for the circle's deeper commitment to bridging philosophy and science, but Mach's influence alone did not produce the Vienna Circle. There was also the dramatic development in mathematical logic wrought by Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, and Alfred North Whitehead. Frege had begun to show how arithmetic could be built from logical principles, opening the possibility of a formal approach to philosophical questions. Russell, in his collaboration with Whitehead on Principia Mathematica, sought to ground all of mathematics in logic. This synergy of logical rigor and scientific empiricism set the stage for something new. A significant bridging figure was Ludwig Wittgenstein, though he was never a formal member of the Vienna Circle. His Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, 1921, deeply impressed many in the circle. Wittgenstein insisted that philosophical problems largely arose from the misuse of language, and that propositions of natural science were the meaningful statements, having a definable logical form linking them to the reality they described. The circle took up Wittgenstein's Tractatus as a kind of blueprint for doing away with speculative metaphysics by analyzing the logical structure of language. However, Wittgenstein himself was a solitary thinker, ambivalent about the circle. He distrusted philosophical societies and found the circle's enthusiastic appropriation of his work somewhat presumptuous. Nevertheless, the meeting of Wittgenstein's logical insights and Mach's empiricism formed the intellectual environment that the circle would inherit, refine, and promulgate. To properly begin, we focus on Moritz Schlick, 1882 to 1936. A German physicist turned philosopher, Schlick completed his PhD under Max Planck in Berlin. Early in his career, he wrote a treatise on the foundations of ethics, Probleme der Ethik, 1930, but soon turned to epistemology and the philosophy of science. In 1922, Schlick was called to the University of Vienna to fill the chair of the philosophy of the inductive sciences, previously held by no less than Ernst Mach. Schlick was charismatic in an understated way, quiet, thoughtful, and tactful, with a gentle sense of humor. Shortly after his arrival in Vienna, Schlick began organizing regular gatherings of like-minded colleagues and students, all exploring the new directions in the philosophy of science. These informal seminars usually took place on Thursday evenings in a small seminar room, or occasionally at Schlick's home. Around the table sat mathematicians, physicists, sociologists, and yes, philosophers, though many of them were suspicious of that very label, the inner core and the allies. Among the earliest participants was Hans Hahn, 1879 to 1934, a mathematician whose work ranged from real analysis to topology. Hahn was a friend of Schlick and shared an intense interest in grounding mathematics on logical and empirical bases. Next was Otto Neurath, 1882 to 1945, a polymath who studied political economy, sociology, and the methodology of the social sciences, and who was passionately socialist. Neurath was an outspoken figure with an abiding interest in how scientific concepts could be translated and unified into a universal scientific language. And then, of course, there was Rudolf Carnap, 1891 to 1970, a German mathematician-philosopher who would become one of the most prominent voices of logical empiricism. It was this cluster, Schlick, Hahn, Neurath, and Carnap, that formed the heart of the Vienna Circle. But there were many others who came regularly: Herbert Feigl, 1902 to 1988, Philipp Frank, 1884 to 1966, Victor Kraft, 1880 to 1975, Kurt Gödel, 1906 to 1978, on some occasions, and even visitors from abroad like Alfred Tarski, 1901 to 1983, or Hans Reichenbach, 1891 to 1953, from Berlin. Scene: a late afternoon gathering in 1924. The University of Vienna, early evening. A small group of intellectuals gathers in a high-ceilinged room with large windows, letting in the dimming autumn light. Papers and journals are scattered on a wooden table. Moritz Schlick sits at the head, wearing a tweed jacket. Hans Hahn, tall and bespectacled, stands next to the blackboard, chalk in hand. Otto Neurath, broad-shouldered and brimming with restless energy, shifts in his seat. Schlick, softly smiling, "It seems we're all here. Shall we begin?" Hans, I recall you were about to explain something about the foundations issue that's been on your mind. Han, tapping the chalk against the board. Indeed. There's been an ongoing debate about whether mathematical statements are purely logical truths, or whether they refer to some abstract reality. Russell and Whitehead take the first route, while many philosophers still cling to metaphysical views of numbers as Platonic entities. I, for one, suspect these metaphysical claims slip in where they're not needed. Neurath, with a slight grin. Metaphysics always creeps in if you let it. A ripple of laughter goes around. Schlick nods in agreement. Schlick, precisely. This is where the careful analysis of language can help. If we define the meaning of mathematical statements in purely formal terms, then the question of any external metaphysical existence of numbers just vanishes. They are what they are within the system of rules. Carnap, raising a hand for attention. But we also need to consider the role of empiricism here. Mathematical truths are tautologies within a formal system, but in the natural sciences, meaning must connect with observation. That's where I think we have to refine the boundary between analytic statements and synthetic statements. Han. Yes, that's the crux. I see a parallel with Mach's stance. Concepts are only meaningful if they're traceable to experience. For mathematics, it's a special case. Analytic truths are not about experience so much as definitions within a formal language. Neurath, leaning forward, let's be sure we don't confine ourselves to just mathematics. We also need to unify the social sciences under the same logic empirical framework. If we can systematically translate sociological concepts into physical terms, we can unify all the sciences. Schlick, with a patient nod. Of course, Otto, the unity of science is part of this entire project, but let's proceed step by step. The main impetus is to strip away meaningless propositions, metaphysical illusions. Carnap, agreed. We must develop clear criteria for meaning, some principle of verifiability perhaps. The group continues discussing well into the evening, voices echoing in the large, nearly empty corridor outside. In these early sessions, the seeds of logical positivism took shape. The principle of verifiability, the distinction between analytic and synthetic truths, the rejection of metaphysics, and the dream of a unified science were central themes. They believed that philosophy should be an activity of logical clarification, not a discipline that generated new truths about intangible realms. Chapter 2. The biographical arc of the core members. To understand the circle's dynamics, we must explore the life stories, personalities, and intellectual developments of its key members. Each brought a unique perspective, shaped by personal background, academic training, and political or social commitments. Moritz Schlick, 1882 to 1936. Moritz Schlick was born in Berlin, the son of a well-to-do family. He studied physics at Heidelberg, Lausanne, and then Berlin, completing his doctorate in 1904 under Max Planck. From the beginning, Schlick had an interest in the philosophical foundations of science, yet he was thoroughly grounded in the emerging new physics. This dual interest allowed him to see how conceptual clarity in science demanded philosophical rigor, and how philosophy itself could benefit from scientific advancement. In 1908, he published Das Wesen der Wahrheit nach der modernen Logik, The Nature of Truth According to Modern Logic, an early foray into bridging logic and epistemology. Around the same time, he wrote on Einstein's theory of relativity, becoming one of the earliest philosophers to fully appreciate its implications. Einstein's revolution, especially the idea that space and time were not absolute but relative to frames of reference, resonated with Mach's earlier critiques of Newtonian absolutes, a synergy that Schlick found enthralling. In 1922, Schlick was appointed to the chair formerly held by Ernst Mach. Inheriting Mach's legacy, Schlick began an ambitious program to reorient philosophy along scientific lines. By 1924, he was regularly holding what would soon be called the Vienna Circle gatherings. Despite his leadership role, Schlick was not a dogmatic figure. He encouraged debate, listened attentively, and aimed for clarity and consensus. However, he could also be firm when it came to essential philosophical distinctions. Friends and students described Schlick as courteous, open-minded, and gentle, yet unwavering about the importance of a logical empirical approach. He possessed a certain serenity, as if convinced that reason would eventually triumph. But this inner calm had a tragic dimension. On June 22, 1936, he was shot and killed by a former student, Johann Nailbock, in the corridors of the University of Vienna. The murder was later exploited by Nazis, who claimed Schlick's Jewish philosophy had provoked the act. Schlick himself was not Jewish, but the logical positivist movement was sometimes denounced by right-wing groups as rootless Jewish intellectualism. Schlick's death was a devastating blow to the circle and symbolized the darkening times in Austria. Hans Hahn, seitsementoista, ihdexentoista, kolmetoista, neljekimentenelie. Hans Hahn was an Austrian mathematician of notable brilliance. Born in Vienna, he studied mathematics in his home city and in Strasbourg. His doctoral work and subsequent publications earned him respect in the field of functional analysis, topology, and the foundations of mathematics. A quiet but deeply engaged figure, Hahn was one of Schlick's closest collaborators in forging the Circle's agenda. He was deeply influenced by the logicist program of Russell and Whitehead, championing the idea that mathematics was an outgrowth of logic. Hahn was also an admirer of David Hilbert's work on the formal foundations of mathematics. This background made him a staunch advocate of clarity and precision in philosophical discourse. Hahn suffered from health problems that limited his full participation in the Circle's later years. Tragically, he passed away in 1934, just 2 years before Schlick was murdered. His early death deprived the Circle of one of its most mathematically astute minds. Nonetheless, his contributions to discussions on the verifiability principle and the place of mathematical statements in logical empiricism were foundational. Otto Neurath, 1882–1945. Otto Neurath was a larger-than-life personality, literally and metaphorically. Born in Vienna, he studied mathematics, economics, and history in multiple universities. Neurath served as a governmental advisor on socialization during the brief Bavarian Soviet Republic in 1919, revealing his strong socialist and utopian leanings. When that experiment collapsed, he was jailed, then released, and returned to Vienna. Neurath's interests were broad, from the methodology of social sciences to the philosophy of science, from political economy to museum design. He had a fervent belief that all scientific discourse could be reduced to a universal slang, an international picture language that would eliminate confusion and enable cross-disciplinary collaboration. This idea fed into the Circle's Unity of Science movement. Neurath was known for his charismatic but domineering style. He could be boisterous, interrupting colleagues in mid-sentence to press a point. He and Schlick had differences over the scope of the Circle's mission. Neurath's political commitments and desire for societal reform were often more radical than Schlick's more purely academic approach. Yet, the two respected each other, and Schlick often gave Neurath the floor to hold forth on sociology and economics. Following the rise of Nazism, Neurath fled Austria for the Netherlands in 1934 and later to England in 1940. He continued working on the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science in collaboration with Carnap and Charles Morris until his death in 1945. Neurath's emphasis on physicalism, the idea that all meaningful statements can be expressed in a physicalistic language, and the protocol sentence debates left a lasting mark on the philosophy of science. Rudolf Carnap, 1891–1970. Born in Ronsdorf, Germany, Carnap studied mathematics, physics, and philosophy in Jena and Freiburg, coming under the influence of Frege's logical work. After military service in World War I, he wrote his dissertation on the concept of space from a logical and philosophical perspective. Carnap moved to Vienna in 1926 at the invitation of Schlick and Hahn, quickly becoming a central figure in the Circle. With publications like Der logische Aufbau der Welt, 1928, and Scheinprobleme in der Philosophie, 1928, Carnap was formulating a systematic reconstruction of knowledge in strictly formal logical terms. Carnap's hallmark was his principle of tolerance, which held that in matters of the foundations of mathematics and language, there is no single correct logic or framework. Rather, one can choose a linguistic framework based on pragmatic or utility considerations. Philosophical disputes often arise from failing to see that different frameworks are at play. This tolerant stance made him the most systematically minded, and in some ways the most open to alternative formulations, even if still firmly within a logical empiricist approach. Carnap left Vienna for Prague in 1931, then emigrated to the United States in 1935 as fascism spread in Europe. He spent most of his career in the US, teaching at the University of Chicago and later at UCLA. There, he became a central figure in American analytic philosophy, influencing subsequent generations of philosophers of science. Herbert Feigl, 1902 to 1988. Born in Reichenberg, Austria-Hungary, today Liberec in the Czech Republic, Feigl studied under Schlick at the University of Vienna. He was among the younger members of the circle, brimming with enthusiasm for the new logical empiricist approach. Feigl's dissertation, Theorie und Erfahrung in der Physik, incorporated the circle's viewpoint that scientific theories must be tied systematically to observation. He quickly befriended Carnap and shared in drafting key statements on the verifiability criterion. Like several others, Feigl emigrated as the political situation deteriorated in the 1930s. In the US, he continued to develop his version of logical empiricism at the University of Iowa and later at the University of Minnesota, where he founded the Minnesota Center for the Philosophy of Science. His lasting influence can be seen in the Anglo-American philosophy of science tradition. Philipp Frank, 1884 to 1966. Born in Vienna, Frank studied physics at the University of Vienna, was a friend of Einstein, and succeeded Mach in a different capacity. A theoretical physicist by training, Frank was drawn into the philosophical underpinnings of relativity and quantum theory. Frank was involved with the circle from the early days, emphasizing the historical and theoretical dimensions of science. He often reminded the group of Einstein's real-world conceptual revolutions as cautionary tales against dogmatism. Frank emigrated to the US in 1938 and became a lecturer at Harvard University, focusing on the history of science and the interplay of physics and philosophy. His 1947 book, Philosophy of Science, introduced many American readers to the Viennese approach to scientific philosophy. Scene: Café Central, Vienna, circa 1927. Outside the formal setting of the university, several members of the circle gather at Café Central, a famous intellectual haunt. The polished marble tables, the smell of coffee, and the hum of conversation create a characteristic Viennese ambience. Present are Schlick, Carnap, Neurath, and Feigl. Neurath, gesturing with a pastry in hand. We must be certain, Moritz, that this is not merely an academic exercise. The unification of science is paramount for societal progress. Schlick, sipping coffee. Otto, I don't disagree that science can illuminate better social policies. However, we must keep the circle's focus, clarifying the logic of scientific language and the empirical grounding of knowledge. Carnap, one does not exclude the other, you know. If we have a rigorous foundation for scientific statements, the social realm can be studied with the same clarity. Otto's physicalism suggests a common language, bridging psychology, sociology, and natural science. Feigl, excitedly. Exactly, and in that sense, metaphysical assertions, like those about vital forces in biology or spiritual essences in the social domain, would be recognized as meaningless if they can't be reformulated in physicalistic terms that connect to observation. Neurath, leaning forward, yes, that's the gist. No statement is immune to revision if new observational facts come in, and we must standardize how we record these observations. Protocol sentences should be in a physicalistic language. Schlick, nodding. Indeed, though let's not forget that we need to refine what exactly counts as a protocol sentence. We're not purely sense data theorists in the old Machian sense, we're acknowledging the structure of language as well. The conversation continues, weaving through the labyrinth of analytic-synthetic distinctions, the place of observation, and the eventual ramifications for social and political philosophy. Such café discussions, half impromptu and half planned, were crucial to the circle's dynamism. They hashed out not only philosophical ideas, but also the practicalities of publications, conferences, and strategies for spreading the word of scientific philosophy. Part 2. Chapter 3. Key theoretical pillars of the Vienna Circle. From these early discussions emerged several pillars that defined the Vienna Circle's philosophical standpoint, often referred to collectively as logical positivism or logical empiricism. The Circle did not always use these labels interchangeably, nor did every member fully agree on every detail. Nevertheless, certain theoretical commitments characterized their common front. 1. The rejection of metaphysics. The Circle members were united in their disdain for what they termed metaphysics, meaning any claims or propositions that could not be verified through observation or logical analysis. They held that statements about the absolute, the infinite, or God were not so much false as meaningless. They were outside the realm of meaningful discourse because no conceivable experience, or set of experiences, could show them to be true or false. While this rejection of metaphysics was a negative doctrine, it served a positive aim: to cleanse philosophy of nonsensical questions, thereby refocusing intellectual efforts on areas amenable to rational scrutiny and empirical support. The Circle believed that the progress of science was often hampered by the infiltration of such metaphysical illusions into scientific discourse. 2. The verifiability principle of meaning. One of the most frequently cited tenets of logical positivism is the verifiability criterion or principle of meaning. A statement is meaningful only if it can, in principle, be verified by observation or is analytic, true, false by virtue of linguistic rules. This principle originated in the work of Schlick, Carnap, and others, partly influenced by Wittgenstein's Tractatus. However, the exact formulation of the principle, and whether it should be falsifiability, confirmability, or testability, varied among members. Schlick initially proposed that meaningful statements must be reducible to protocol sentences describing immediate experience or observation. Carnap took a more flexible approach, allowing for a system of statements to be tested as a whole rather than statement by statement. Neurath argued that all language should be translatable into a physicalistic language. Thus, verification meant checking the statement against intersubjective physical observations. As the Circle progressed, they faced challenges in formalizing a rigid verification principle. Some critics argued that universal scientific laws, all ravens are black, could never be conclusively verified. Internal debates led to modifications. Some members moved toward a confirmation theory, where statements were assigned degrees of confirmation rather than pass-fail verification. 3. The distinction between analytic and synthetic propositions. Building on the work of Hume and Kant, and more directly on Frege and Russell, the Circle affirmed a fundamental distinction. Analytic propositions are true or false in virtue of linguistic or logical conventions, e.g., all bachelors are unmarried. Synthetic propositions require empirical verification, e.g., all swans are white. This distinction underpinned their program, since they saw metaphysics as neither analytic nor synthetic and therefore meaningless. The refinement of this distinction became a major focus for Carnap in his later works, though it would be famously critiqued by W. V. O. Quine in the 1950s. 4. The unity of science. The Circle dreamt of a unified science, meaning that all scientific statements, whether from physics, biology, psychology, or sociology, could be expressed in a common language, physicalism. The methods of verification or confirmation would be essentially the same across all domains of inquiry. Philosophical problems largely reduced to problems of language, logic, and methodology. Thus, there is no fundamental cleavage between philosophy and science. Otto Neurath championed the unity of science more passionately than anyone else, co-organizing the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science with Carnap and Charles Morris. Though incomplete, this massive project aimed to compile and harmonize scientific knowledge for a broad readership. 5. Emphasis on logical analysis and formal methods. From Wittgenstein's Tractatus to Russell's Principia Mathematica, the circle saw formal logic as a powerful tool to clarify concepts and eliminate confusion. Carnap in particular devoted extensive effort to formal systems in which philosophical problems, such as the nature of space or time, could be reformulated and solved via logical and linguistic means. Scene: The Protocol Sentence Debate, circa 1929. University of Vienna, a small classroom with a blackboard. Carnap stands at the board, a series of symbols written in logical notation. Schlick and Neurath are seated at desks. A few other circle members look on. The air is tense, but amicable. Carnap: In my proposed construction, we begin with elementary experiences, protocol sentences, which record the direct observation of a single individual at a specific time. Then, by a rule-based procedure, we build up the entire network of scientific knowledge. Neurath, frowning slightly. But Rudolf, you're reverting to a kind of sense data language. What of physicalism? We want a language that's intersubjective from the start. Protocol sentences that rely on private experiences are a step backward. Carnap, thinking a moment. I see the concern. My aim is not to reintroduce metaphysics of the sense data variety. Rather, it's a logical method. You start with, I see a red patch now, as a foundational statement, then proceed to the more complex constructs. Neurath: But if the ultimate test of a statement's meaning is communal verification, shouldn't protocol sentences themselves be framed in a physicalist idiom? Something like, there is a red patch on the table under these lighting conditions as publicly observable, so that it's verifiable by multiple observers. Schlick, interjecting calmly: Gentlemen, let us not forget that the very reason for protocol sentences is to anchor scientific statements in observation. The question is whether that anchor is private sense data or an intersubjective physical description. Neurath, insistently: Precisely. And I say it must be the latter, to avoid the labyrinth of subjectivity. A low murmur of agreement from some in the room. Carnap raises his eyebrows, clearly pondering Neurath's point. Carnap: I grant that the communal aspect is crucial. Let's discuss a revision. We can treat protocol sentences as statements about physical events in space-time, yes, but they record the immediate observation of an individual at a time. They remain subject to intersubjective checking. Neurath, smiling: Good, good. That's a step in the right direction. Schlick: Let's refine it further in our next meeting. The group disperses, each thinking about how to reconcile immediate experience with the communal basis of scientific knowledge. This protocol sentence debate would rage for some years, revealing a major fault line within logical positivism. How do we reconcile the seemingly private nature of sense experience with the public language of science? Chapter 4: Tensions and Disagreements. Within the circle. Despite a broad common front, the Vienna Circle was not monolithic. Several major points of tension manifested over the years. Private sense data versus physicalism. Schlick was open to the idea that protocol sentences might be expressed in first-person immediate sense data terms. Neurath argued for a purely physicalist language from the outset. Carnap vacillated but tended over time toward Neurath's view, eventually adopting physicalism more thoroughly. The status of Wittgenstein's ideas. Wittgenstein was admired but also elusive and uncooperative. He insisted that philosophical problems would disappear if one understood the logic of language. The circle hoped to glean from him a further endorsement of the verifiability principle, but Wittgenstein regarded some of their interpretations as shallow. Some members, Carnap, Schlick, tried to incorporate or adapt Wittgenstein's picture theory of language, while others, Neurath, were less enamored, focusing on scientific discourse rather than the metaphysics of picturing. Politics and sociology. Neurath was a socialist activist, insisting that the circle engage politically. He saw no sharp line between scientific philosophy and social reform. Schlick maintained a more apolitical academic stance, though personally he was not conservative. This difference in emphasis sometimes created friction over how aggressively the circle should promote social change as part of its mission. Ethics and value judgments. Logical positivism tended to treat ethical statements as expressions of emotion or prescriptions rather than factual claims. Schlick wrote on ethics but generally placed value judgments outside the domain of verifiable propositions. Carnap and others followed a similar line, seeing ethics as a domain of conventional or emotive expressions rather than factual knowledge. Completeness of logical empiricism. Even within the circle, some wondered whether strict verifiability might exclude too many scientific statements, like universal laws, which are never fully verifiable. Gradually, a confirmation or probabilistic approach emerged, but not without internal debate. These disagreements did not prevent them from cooperating on publications and events, but they do illustrate that the circle was dynamic, evolving, and sometimes fractious. Part 3. Chapter 5. The Influence of Wittgenstein. No account of the Vienna Circle is complete without delving into the complicated relationship with Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1889 to 1951. Although not formally a member, his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, published in German in 1921 and in English in 1922, profoundly shaped the Circle's thinking. The opening lines of the Tractatus, "The world is everything that is the case," seemed to them a clarion call for an ontology of facts, not metaphysical illusions. Moreover, Wittgenstein's insistence that a meaningful proposition must have a determinate truth condition was aligned with the Circle's drive toward verifiability. However, Wittgenstein in person was aloof, temperamentally ill-suited to group discussions. He had left philosophy for a time, working as a schoolteacher in rural Austria, then returning to Cambridge. When he visited Vienna, Schlick often tried to arrange meetings between him and Circle members. Wittgenstein did visit them a few times, but these encounters were fraught. Wittgenstein would lash out if he felt the Circle misunderstood his work or asked the wrong kind of question. The famous encounter. A well-known anecdote has Wittgenstein visiting the Circle and reading poetry aloud, becoming agitated when they attempted to interpret it in logical empiricist terms. Another story tells of Wittgenstein angrily berating Carnap or Feigl for focusing too literally on the language of observation reports rather than seeing the deeper, mystical dimension that Wittgenstein claimed near the end of the Tractatus. Much of the Circle's interpretation of Wittgenstein was that the Tractatus offered a roadmap to cleanse language of metaphysics. Wittgenstein, on the other hand, was moving beyond that framework, eventually working on the ideas that would become philosophical investigations, published posthumously in 1953. By the 1930s, he had rejected significant parts of the Tractatus and no longer saw eye to eye with the Circle. Nevertheless, Wittgenstein's early impact was considerable, particularly the notion that philosophical problems arise from logical confusions and that clarity in language is the remedy. This impetus fueled the Circle's pursuit of logical analysis as the core method of philosophy. Chapter 6. Relationship with Karl Popper. Another Viennese thinker who loomed around the Circle's periphery was Karl Popper, 1902 to 1994. Although he sometimes is lumped together with the logical positivists, Popper adamantly rejected the verifiability principle in favor of falsifiability. Popper argued that science proceeds not by verifying hypotheses, but by rigorously attempting to refute them. A good scientific theory is one that makes bold predictions, thus risking falsification. He saw the Circle's emphasis on verification as misguided because no finite set of observations can ever verify a universal statement. Instead, Popper insisted that testability arises from the possibility of falsification. In Logik der Forschung, 1934, Popper singled out the logical positivists for criticism. Yet ironically, many members of the Circle welcomed Popper's approach, seeing it as a close cousin to their own. Carnap and others acknowledged that falsification could be a more workable demarcation criterion. Still, fundamental disagreements remained. Popper also criticized the Circle's stance on probability, induction, and the role of observation. Over the years, the Circle and Popper's followers engaged in friendly, if sometimes pointed, debates that helped shape the broader philosophy of science. Chapter 7. The Unity of Science Movement. One of the Circle's most ambitious projects was the Unity of Science movement, spearheaded by Otto Neurath. In 1935, Neurath, Carnap, and American philosopher Charles Morris launched the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science, published by the University of Chicago Press. The goal was to produce a multi-volume encyclopedia that would systematize all fields of inquiry, natural sciences, social sciences, mathematics, and even the humanities, into one coherent framework. For the circle, physicalism, the idea that all statements could be expressed in a physical language, was the key to unification. This language would reference publicly observable entities and events in space-time, eliminating the murkiness of subjective or metaphysical concepts. Neurath believed that once all sciences were expressed in such a framework, they would interlock seamlessly into a single body of knowledge. World events and the complexities of interdisciplinary work meant that the grand project never reached full fruition. Only a handful of volumes were completed, including Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, 1962, ironically a text that would challenge many of the logical positivist assumptions. Nonetheless, the unity of science movement left a lasting legacy, influencing debates on reductionism, inter-theoretic relations, and scientific collaboration. Chapter 8. Catastrophe and Diaspora. Tragically, the story of the Vienna Circle cannot be separated from the ominous rise of fascism in Europe. Austria in the 1930s was increasingly polarized. Reactionary forces denounced the Circle's members as cosmopolitan, Jewish, or Marxist. Anti-Semitism mounted, and while not all members of the Circle were Jewish, many were, and virtually all were considered enemies by far-right ideologues. On June 22, 1936, Schlick was walking in the main building of the University of Vienna when Johann Nelbach, a former student with a history of mental instability, approached and shot him. Schlick died immediately. Nelbach gave confused statements, but some indicated that he believed Schlick's philosophy had thwarted his own ambitions or was corrupting society. Disturbingly, segments of Viennese society, including some Nazi sympathizers, expressed approval, or at least a lack of condemnation for the killing, effectively blaming Schlick for espousing heretical ideas. Schlick's death dealt a shattering blow to the Circle. Hans Hahn had already died in 1934, and now Schlick's guiding presence was gone. Fear spread among remaining members and intellectuals. In the years following, the remaining prominent members left Austria. Carnap had already moved to Prague in 1931 and then left for the United States in 1935. Neurath fled to the Netherlands in 1934, then to England in 1940. Feigl and Frank both emigrated to the USSR. Vienna, once a beacon of high culture and progressive thought, was overtaken by the Anschluss in 1938, when Nazi Germany annexed Austria. Any semblance of intellectual freedom for the logical positivists vanished. The Circle as an organized entity disintegrated. Chapter 9. The Transplantation of Logical Positivism to the Anglophone World. The diaspora of the Vienna Circle's members had a profound impact on the development of philosophy in the United States and Britain. Once arrived in their new homes, these refugees continued their projects, teaching generations of students. Carnap at the University of Chicago and later UCLA, Feigl at the University of Minnesota, Reichenbach from the Berlin Circle at UCLA, and others created influential departments and forums for analytic philosophy. In the Anglophone world, the reception was mixed. On one hand, the Circle's emphasis on logical analysis fit well with the existing tradition of analytic philosophy initiated by Russell and Moore in Britain. On the other hand, the verifiability criterion met with criticisms from philosophers like A.J. Ayer, who attempted to refine it in Language, Truth and Logic, 1936, and later from W.V.O. Quine, who attacked the analytic-synthetic distinction in his 1951 paper, Two Dogmas of Empiricism. The new environment saw the growth of the philosophy of science as a recognized subdiscipline. The influences of the Vienna Circle's members were central in shaping it, focusing on logic, the structure of theories, and the role of observation. University programs and journals dedicated specifically to the philosophy of science proliferated after World War II, in large part due to the seeds planted by these émigrés. Part 4. Chapter 10. The Later Critiques and the Evolution of Ideas. After World War II, logical positivism, or logical empiricism, as many now preferred, was not the same as it had been in Vienna. The movement evolved in response to criticisms and internal developments. Two dogmas argued that the distinction between analytic and synthetic statements was untenable, and that empirical verification operates at the level of a whole web of beliefs rather than individual statements. This critique undermined a central pillar of the Vienna Circle's philosophy: the structure of scientific revolutions, published as part of the International Encyclopedia of Unified Science, ironically. Kuhn introduced the concept of paradigm shifts, challenging the Circle's incremental view of scientific progress via accumulation of verified facts. Kuhn's emphasis on the sociological and historical dimensions of science contrasted sharply with the Circle's focus on logic and methodology. Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations, 1953, took a very different approach to language, focusing on its use in everyday language games, moving away from the formalism of the Circle. Ordinary language philosophy in Oxford, Ryle, Austin, also steered away from the ideal language approach of logical positivism. Still, much of what is now standard in the analytic tradition, clarity of argument, logical analysis, emphasis on language, skepticism about metaphysics, bears the imprint of the Vienna Circle. Their legacy survived even as their specific doctrines were revised or abandoned. Chapter 11. Lasting Contributions and Legacy. What remains of the Vienna Circle's project? Historians of philosophy note that no major philosophical movement in the 20th century has been free from the Circle's influence. Even critics are shaped by responding to the Circle's ideas. The Circle insisted on formal clarity and empirical grounding. This set the tone for much of analytic philosophy, especially in the English-speaking world. By focusing on verification, theory structure, and empirical testing, the Circle helped institutionalize the philosophy of science as a key philosophical area. While not realized in the grand form Neurath envisioned, the dream of integrating knowledge across disciplines persists in various forms, e.g., interdisciplinary research, cognitive science, theoretical biology. The Circle popularized the use of formal logic as a philosophical tool, which continues in contemporary analytic philosophy, computational linguistics, and philosophy of mind. Even though few philosophers today adhere to a strict verification principle, the impetus to demand clarity and testability for metaphysical claims persists. Philosophers remain wary of reified abstractions without clear explanatory role. Thus, the Circle's legacy is woven into the fabric of modern thought, even if the original movement, as it existed in Vienna, was irreparably shattered by historical forces. Scene: an imagined reunion, late 1940s, somewhere in the US. This is purely a hypothetical scenario. Schlick was murdered in 1936, Hahn died in 1934, Neurath passed away in 1945. But imagine if some members, Carnap, Feigl, Frank, sat together for dinner in Chicago or Boston, reflecting on their youth in Vienna. Carnap, older, hair graying at the temples. Sometimes I recall those Thursday evenings at Schlick's seminar room, the sense of excitement, the conviction that we were forging a new path in philosophy. Feigl, nodding, sipping a glass of wine. I do too. The energy was infectious. Of course, we never imagined how dark the world would turn. Frank, sadly. Or that Schlick would be taken from us so soon. And then, the war. The exiles. Carnap, brightening a bit. But we've managed to continue the work, haven't we? Students here are eager, open-minded. They don't have the same cultural baggage of the old Europe. Feigl, true. They sometimes even find our anti-metaphysical crusade quaint. They share a gentle laugh, aware that times have changed and that logical positivism has become both a galvanizing and a contested term. Frank, we've lost much, but the ideas live on in ways we might not have expected. I think Schlick would be pleased to know that we helped shape the direction of philosophy in the 20th century. Carnap. Yes, indeed. Let us toast to that. They raise their glasses, a silent tribute to their departed friends to the city of Vienna, and to the persistent dream of a clear, unified knowledge. Part 5. Summation of disagreements and key thematic threads. Although the circle is often caricatured as a monolith, we have seen that its members had spirited internal disagreements. Some of the main thematic fault lines, foundational language, private sense data versus physicalist language from the get-go, protocol sentences, should they be first-person observational claims or communal physical descriptions, verifiability versus falsifiability, tension between Popper's challenge and the circle's emphasis on verification. Scope of philosophy. Should philosophy address social and political issues more directly, Neurath, or remain a purely logical empirical inquiry, Schlick? Ethics and values, the extent to which ethical judgments can or cannot be subject to empirical analysis. Despite such disputes, they shared an overarching commitment to the scientific worldview, the elimination of metaphysical nonsense, and the belief that the progress of philosophy lay in clarifying language and sharpening logical methods. Chapter 12. Epilogue. The Vienna Circle's place in the history of ideas. Standing at a distance of nearly a century, we can see the Vienna Circle as emblematic of the modernist ethos in philosophy: clarity, progress, emancipation from tradition, and faith in the power of science. They were the heirs of Enlightenment rationality, but living at a time when irrational forces in politics and culture were ascendant. The irony is poignant. They championed reason, yet fascism and totalitarian ideologies rose around them, eventually extinguishing their communal project in Vienna. Nevertheless, the diaspora of its members spread their ideas far and wide, influencing academic philosophy, the methodology of science, and even the structure of American higher education, through the creation of specialized institutes and journals. They helped shape the analytic approach that dominates much of North American and British philosophy to this day, even though many of their central doctrines, strict verifiability, the analytic-synthetic dichotomy, have been heavily revised or supplanted. Their story is a testament to the interconnectedness of ideas and the political, social contexts in which they unfold. Though they might have hoped to stand above politics, the murder of Schlick and the forced emigration of the others demonstrated that no purely philosophical endeavor can be wholly divorced from the currents of history. Final reflection. To this day, debates about the meaning of scientific statements, the role of philosophy vis-à-vis science, and the legitimate boundaries of metaphysical speculation bear the stamp of the Vienna Circle's inquiries. Their mission, to bring philosophy into alignment with the rigor and empirical basis of science, remains an ongoing challenge. While the Circle's specific formulations may have been critiqued or abandoned, the spirit of empirically informed, logically coherent, and anti-dogmatic philosophy endures. In the grand tapestry of intellectual history, the Vienna Circle occupies a chapter that blazed bright in a brief but intensely creative period. Their legacy is woven into the language of contemporary philosophy, ensuring that even those who reject their conclusions continue to grapple with the questions they posed. Indeed, the story of the Vienna Circle is not just a tale of a group of philosophers in interwar Vienna. It is a story about the very possibility of reason and clarity in a tumultuous world, and how those ideals can be both inspiring and tragically vulnerable. Moritz Schlick, a deeper portrait. Moritz Schlick's life, cut short by violence, warrants a more thorough exploration. Born on April 14, 1882 in Berlin, Schlick displayed from a young age an aptitude for both the natural sciences and the arts. Family letters suggest he was equally capable of writing a short poem or dissecting a complex geometry problem. This unusual blend of sensitivity and analytical prowess might explain his later temperament as a philosopher: patient, reflective, and yet incisive. Max Planck and physics. Under Planck's guidance, Schlick immersed himself in the nascent field of quantum theory. He witnessed firsthand how theoretical physics was stepping beyond Newtonian mechanics into a realm that challenged classical intuitions. Einstein's relativity. Schlick was one of the first philosophers to take Einstein's theories seriously, He was intrigued not merely by the new equations, but by how they redefined concepts like simultaneity, length, and time intervals. This resonated with Mach's call to eliminate absolute frameworks in favor of relative, observer-based descriptions. Kant versus anti-Kantian, Schlick's relationship to Kant's philosophy was complex. On one hand, he admired Kant's systematic approach to the conditions of knowledge. On the other, he felt Einstein's revolution showed that space and time were not the a priori forms Kant had presumed. He thus saw the new physics as dethroning the synthetic a priori. Schlick's earliest philosophical works included essays on epistemology and ethics. One often overlooked aspect of Schlick is his Problem der Ethik, Problems of Ethics, in which he wrestled with how morality might be grounded in human nature rather than in metaphysical oughts. This moral thinking, while overshadowed by his scientific philosophy, indicates he was not indifferent to human values. Instead, he tried to place them on an empirical and psychological foundation, consistent with his overall positivist inclinations. Accounts from students describe him as encouraging, yet exacting. He led seminars where a student might propose a thesis, only for Schlick to question each assumption carefully. Nevertheless, he never humiliated them, or resorted to rhetorical dominance. He believed philosophy was a collective endeavor, advanced by reasoned dialogue, precisely what the circle embodied. After the shocking event of June 22, 1936, tributes poured in from academics worldwide. Albert Einstein, upon hearing of Schlick's murder, reportedly expressed profound dismay that such an urbane, peace-loving mind had been struck down. The Austrian press coverage was disturbingly varied. Some editorials implied that Schlick's radical philosophies had helped cause his own demise. This reaction underscored the climate of hostility that had been festering in Vienna and hinted at the broader ideology soon to take the country in its grip. Hans Hahn, more than a mathematician. Hans Hahn's significance often gets overshadowed by Schlick, Carnap, and Neurath, but he was critical in anchoring the circle's approach to mathematics. Born on September 27, 1879, in Vienna, Hahn showed early brilliance in abstract thinking. His contributions to real analysis and set theory placed him among the foremost mathematicians of his generation. Hahn's path into the philosophical realm was guided by a curiosity about the nature of mathematical truth. He followed the debates around Hilbert's formalism and Brouwer's intuitionism, eventually leaning toward a formalist logicist outlook. This orientation meshed well with Schlick's emphasis on logical clarity and empirical grounding. Hahn's presence in the circle ensured that the philosophical discussions remained tethered to real developments in mathematics, preventing them from becoming purely speculative. By the early 1930s, Hahn's health deteriorated. Letters from Carnap and others document their concern as Hahn's participation in meetings became sporadic. He died on July 24, 1934. Some historians argue that had Hahn lived longer, the circle might have navigated the protocol sentence debate differently, given his nuanced stance on the interplay between mathematics and empirical observation. Otto Neurath, the encyclopedist of the circle. Few figures among the circle were as energetic or wide-ranging as Otto Neurath. Born on December 10, 1882, also in Vienna, his father was a political economist, and Otto inherited a sense of social mission. He earned his doctorate in the political science field and soon was enthralled by the prospects of using scientific methods to reorganize society. Neurath's mind darted across disciplines, from political economy to urban planning, from museum exhibits to visual education. He famously developed the international system of typographic picture education, isotype, a method of using pictograms to represent statistical data in a manner easily understood by laypeople. This was, in essence, his attempt at unifying knowledge visually and functionally. Neurath's leftist leanings drew him into radical politics. During the short-lived Bavarian Soviet Republic in 1919, he served as the head of the Central Economic Administration. When that government fell, Neurath was imprisoned. Upon release, he fled to Austria. This experience solidified his conviction that scientific planning and a rationally organized economy could replace the chaos of capitalist markets. While Schlick and Carnap were not apolitical, they did not share Neurath's fervor for direct societal transformation. Neurath argued vigorously for a universal physical language in which every legitimate statement could be framed. He considered talk of mental states or subjective experiences as translatable into statements about physical occurrences in bodies and environments. This stance not only shaped the circle's direction, but also anticipated later debates in philosophy of mind about reductionism and identity theory. With Austria's political collapse imminent, Neurath moved to The Hague in 1934. In 1940, as Nazi forces occupied the Netherlands, Neurath barely escaped to England by boat, losing most of his library and manuscripts in the harrowing journey. His final years in Oxford were dedicated to continuing the encyclopedia project and refining his ideas on unified science. He died on December 22, 1945, leaving behind an extensive but scattered legacy. Rudolf Carnap, system builder extraordinaire. Rudolf Carnap was born on May 18, 1891, in Ronsdorf, now part of Wuppertal, Germany. Raised in a pious household, he found his way to philosophy through mathematics. He studied under Gottlob Frege at the University of Vienna, acquiring the rigorous approach to logic that would define his career. Key works: Der logische Aufbau der Welt, 1928, versucht eine rational reconstruction aller wissenschaftlichen Konzepte aus einem minimalen Satz elementarer Erfahrungen via logische Definitionen. Scheinprobleme in der Philosophie, 1928. Denounced many philosophical controversies as pseudo-problems arising from misuse of language. Logische Syntax der Sprache, 1934. Introduced Carnap's principle of tolerance. Different logical frameworks might be equally valid. The choice depends on pragmatic criteria. Carnap's philosophy evolved considerably. Early on, he leaned toward a strict sense data foundation, but under Neurath's pressure, he shifted toward physicalism. Later, he expanded his views on probability, semantic analysis, and the use of formal languages in philosophy. His time in the United States exposed him to a broader circle of critics, including Quine, leading to further refinements of his position. Personality? Most accounts describe Carnap as gentle, methodical, and open to discussion. Unlike Neurath, he avoided strident debate tactics, preferring carefully reasoned arguments and incremental revisions. In academic settings, Carnap was revered for his clarity and systematic approach, though critics sometimes found his writing dense and overly technical. Herbert Feigl and Philipp Frank, carriers of the flame. A younger member, Herbert Feigl's significance lies in how he transplanted logical positivist ideas into the American academic scene. He was deeply influenced by Schlick and completed his doctorate under him in 1927. Later in the US, he co-founded the Minnesota Center for the Philosophy of Science, shaping it into a hub for empirically oriented philosophy. Feigl maintained that mental states could eventually be understood in physical terms, and his essay, The Mental and the Physical, 1958, is considered a landmark in the mind-body problem debate. Frank, a close associate of Einstein, wrote extensively on the philosophy of physics, bridging the conceptual revolutions from Mach to Einstein. In the US, he produced works that contextualized scientific theories within their historical and cultural frameworks. Perhaps more than some of his circle colleagues, Frank understood that scientific theories do not emerge from pure logic alone. They are grounded in experimental practice and shaped by theoretical commitments. Additional narrative vignette, The Invitation of Kurt Gödel. Kurt Gödel, 1906 to 1978, though not an official member, occasionally visited the circle. Famous for his incompleteness theorems, published in 1931, Gödel showed that any sufficiently powerful formal system of arithmetic contains statements that cannot be proved within the system. This result rattled the Hilbertian dream of complete formalization, and by extension, affected the circle's pursuit of a perfectly logical reconstruction of all knowledge. Scene: Late Evening Discussion, 1932. The University of Vienna Library, lamps casting long shadows among the shelves. Carnap and Neurath are talking quietly. Gödel appears, hesitant. Carnap, smiling. Kurt, please join us. I've been wrestling with the implications of your incompleteness proof. Gödel, soft voice. Well, it suggests that within any robust formal system, there are true statements that elude proof from the axioms. Neurath, with a grin, but does that sabotage our entire project of unifying science? Gödel, shrugging, almost embarrassed. It depends on what you mean by unification. My theorem is about formal axiomatic systems of arithmetic. Science can still rely on observation, empirical testing, which is a different domain. Carnap, nodding thoughtfully. So perhaps it indicates that no single formal system can capture all mathematical truths, but that does not necessarily translate into the collapse of logical empiricism. We can adopt multiple frameworks under my principle of tolerance. Neurath, a patchwork of systems, as I like to say. We do not need a single perfect system. We only need effective scientific cooperation. Gödel nods, half smiling. He is more comfortable discussing logic with Carnap than diving into the circle's socio-political aims. In reality, Gödel was cautious around the circle. He shared their admiration for logic, but he was more conservative and religious than they were, and his theorems had complex philosophical implications that some of them found unsettling. Nonetheless, Gödel's presence in Vienna contributed another layer of depth to the intellectual milieu of the time. Deep dive. The protocol sentence debate revisited. Because this debate was so crucial and reveals the circle's internal friction, we revisit it in more detail. The question, how do we ground scientific knowledge in observation? Schlick's early view, protocol sentences are incorrigible reports of private experience, e.g., now I see a patch of red. Neurath's physicalism, protocol sentences should be communal, e.g., under standard conditions a red patch appears at location X. The observer is a physical instrument among others. Carnap's revised position initially followed Schlick, later moved toward Neurath, concluding that I see red is not logically privileged over there is something red in the room, provided we define observation conditions, consequences. If protocol sentences are private, how do we compare them across observers? If they are public, do we lose the direct link to subjective experience? Does the entire enterprise devolve into relativism if there is no absolute foundation? Carnap's final stance was that the choice of protocol language is a matter of convention. There is no ultimate right foundation, as long as the system remains empirically consistent and fruitful. This pragmatic move was emblematic of the circle's growing flexibility. Additional disagreements, the role of induction. The circle inherited from David Hume the problem of induction. How do we justify inductive inferences logically? They recognized that verifying a universal statement, all swans are white, by observing many white swans is never conclusive. Yet induction is a cornerstone of scientific practice. Schlick. Induction might be a practical habit, justified by its success. Carnap attempted a formal approach to inductive logic, introducing degrees of confirmation. This eventually led to work on probability and Bayesian approaches in philosophy of science. Neurath emphasized the holistic social process of science, where theories are tested collectively. One does not so much prove them as refine them, guided by communal consensus. None were fully satisfied with the ultimate justification of induction, but they believed that acknowledging the problem was more honest than ignoring it. This stance paved the way for later developments in probabilistic reasoning in the philosophy of science. The circle's scientific collaborations. Beyond formal philosophy, many members were accomplished scientists. For instance, Philipp Frank was intimately involved with Einstein's circle. Herbert Feigl engaged with psychologists and neuroscientists in the United States, exploring how mental phenomena might be explained physically. Otto Neurath's social science. Neurath set up institutes to analyze economic data using his pictorial statistics. He believed that clarity in data presentation could enlighten the masses, reducing the chance of manipulation by totalitarian regimes. This was part of his lifelong crusade for an Aufklärung, enlightenment, of modern society. Collaborations with the Berlin Circle. The Berlin Society for Empirical Philosophy, often called the Berlin Circle, included figures like Hans Reichenbach and Carl Gustav Hempel. Although separate from the Vienna circle, they shared similar aims. Reichenbach and Carnap exchanged ideas frequently on probability and induction. Hempel would later articulate the covering law model of explanation, a direct descendant of the Vienna circle's approach to scientific explanation. Broad cultural impact in interwar Vienna. Vienna between the wars was a cauldron of modernism. In music, Arnold Schoenberg's 12-tone technique paralleled the circle's radical attempts to systematically rework an established tradition. In architecture, Adolf Loos was pioneering functional simplicity, resonating with the circle's call to strip away decorative metaphysical fluff. Intellectual cross-fertilization was rampant, although direct collaboration between the circle and these other artistic movements was limited. Still, the cultural climate of innovation and bold rejection of the past is a shared zeitgeist. Scene: A Chance Encounter with Arnold Schoenberg, 1928. Purely hypothetical, but set at a possible venue, say, an event in the concert house. Schlick and Neurath attend a performance of Schoenberg's new piece. Neurath, whispering to Schlick during intermission. Schoenberg's method is like us. He tosses out the old tonal structure as metaphysical baggage. Schlick, nodding, somewhat amused. Yes, but are we sure the ear can follow such logic? Neurath, grinning. Perhaps not easily, but if we create a new musical language, we can build it up systematically like Carnap's Aufbau. They share a laugh, returning to their seats. Whether they ever directly engaged with Schoenberg is uncertain, but the parallel spirit of modernization is unmistakable. The Circle's publications and manifestos. Wissenschaftliche Weltauffassung, der Wiener Kreis, 1929. Often called the Manifesto of the Vienna Circle, authored primarily by Hahn, Neurath and Carnap, with input from Schlick. Outlined the Circle's stance on the scientific worldview, the role of logical analysis, and the rejection of metaphysics. Emphasized the social dimension of their project. A scientifically informed society would be more rational and democratic. Erkenntnis, a journal co-founded by the Circle and members of the Berlin Circle. Published seminal papers, including those by Reichenbach, Carnap, and Hempel. Acted as the main outlet for logical empiricist research until disrupted by political upheaval in Germany and Austria. International Encyclopedia of Unified Science. A grand multi-volume undertaking to unify and systematize all scientific knowledge. Only a few volumes were completed, but it remains a fascinating historical artifact containing Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions. These publications were strategic efforts to disseminate the Circle's ideas beyond Vienna, forging an international network of sympathizers and collaborators. The Diaspora Years, Nodes of Influence. After fleeing Europe, the exiled Circle members formed new intellectual nodes in North America and Britain. Carnap, University of Chicago, then UCLA. He fostered the next generation of analytic philosophers, influencing figures like Donald Davidson and Hilary Putnam. Feigl founded the Minnesota Center for the Philosophy of Science, attracting scholars like Michael Scriven, Grover Maxwell, and Herbert Simon. Frank. At Harvard, he engaged historians of science and promoted a more historically informed philosophy. Neurath, in England, worked with the London School of Economics circle that included Karl Popper and Friedrich Hayek, despite political differences. The result was a broad infusion of logical empiricist ideals into multiple academic institutions, shaping curricula and research agendas. By the 1950s, the phrase logical positivism was well known in American universities, though often misunderstood or subjected to caricature. Critiques and the Circle's self-reflections. By the 1940s and 1950s, the Circle's leading lights were aware that some of their initial formulations had grown outdated. They acknowledged problems: overly narrow verifiability. Some statements seem meaningful without being strictly verifiable, e.g., scientific laws, counterfactuals, statements about the past, etc. Carnap revised the principle to a probabilistic or confirmation-based approach, but recognized complexities remain. The problem of theory-ladenness. Philosophers of science like Norwood Hansen, Mary Hesse, and later Kuhn argued that observation itself is influenced by theoretical assumptions. This complicates a simple observation versus theory dichotomy. The Circle's members had hints of this in Neurath's holistic approach, but had not fully articulated the consequences. Naturalized epistemology. Quine suggested that epistemology should be continuous with empirical psychology, challenging the notion that epistemology can be established purely on logical grounds. This was a fundamental shift from the Circle's belief in a logical reconstruction of knowledge. Nonetheless, many of the Circle's core ideas, clarity in language, the centrality of empirical testing, the use of logical methods, remained cornerstones in the subsequent evolution of analytic philosophy. Scene: Carnap and Quine in Princeton, late 1940s. Rudolf Carnap pays a visit to Princeton, where W.V.O. Quine is based. They stroll through the campus, discussing philosophy. This conversation is partly drawn from known historical recollections, though dramatized here. Quine, casual tone. I admire much of your work, Carnap, especially the rigor. But I have my doubts about the analytic-synthetic distinction. Carnap, patient smile. Yes, I've heard. You believe the distinction is blurred in practice. Quine. More than blurred. I suspect there's no principled basis for calling a statement analytic if it can be revised in light of empirical discoveries. Even logic and mathematics are open to revision in principle. Carnap. Our principle of tolerance indeed allows for different frameworks, including ones where classical logic might be questioned. But how do we keep track of meaning if everything is subject to change? Quine, shrugging. We do it holistically. Our entire web of belief, including logic, stands or falls in relation to sensory input. Carnap, sighing lightly. That is quite a radical stance. Still, I see some family resemblance to the holistic views Neurath proposed. Perhaps logical empiricism can incorporate it, though it may require further modifications. They continue along the path, each quietly reflecting on the future trajectory of analytic philosophy. This friendly friction with Quine would define much of mid-20th century analytic philosophy, showcasing the Circle's capacity to evolve even after its geographic dispersal. 1. The Circle's larger historical context. To fully appreciate the Vienna Circle, one must situate it in the broader tapestry of interwar Europe. The end of World War I saw the Austro-Hungarian Empire dismantled, leading to social upheaval, economic instability, and a crisis of cultural identity. Vienna, once the opulent capital of a vast empire, became the modest center of a small republic. Intellectuals grappled with forging a new sense of Austrian identity. Simultaneously, new scientific developments, quantum mechanics, relativity, were challenging old certainties. Philosophers and scientists alike felt that the world needed new conceptual tools. The Circle was thus not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a general wave of modernist rethinking across Europe, encompassing architecture, the Bauhaus in Germany, literature, the Expressionists and Dadaists, and psychology, Freud, Jung, Adler, the political spectrum. Socialist experiments flourished in the Red Vienna of the 1920s, fueling public housing initiatives and progressive social policies. Conservative and nationalist factions resisted, culminating in the rise of Austrofascism under Engelbert Dollfuss, and later the Anschluss with Nazi Germany. The Vienna Circle's emphasis on rational discourse and empirical facts clashed with the growing tide of ethno-nationalist and irrationalist politics. Understanding this context highlights the Circle's precarious position. They were rationalists in an increasingly irrational world, internationalists in a climate of fervent nationalism. 2. Comparisons to continental philosophy of the same era. Phenomenology. While the Vienna Circle was blossoming in Austria, across the border in Germany, Edmund Husserl's phenomenology was prominent. Phenomenology sought to analyze the structures of consciousness. From the Circle's perspective, phenomenology often seemed tainted with introspective, metaphysical language. Some members, especially Schlick, did read Husserl and tried to connect sense data theories with phenomenological description, but the Circle eventually dismissed most of phenomenology as insufficiently grounded in public verification. Existentialism. In the 1930s, figures like Martin Heidegger and Jean-Paul Sartre were developing existential philosophy, focusing on human freedom, authenticity, and the meaning of being. The Vienna Circle, for the most part, regarded such inquiries as reifications of language, a return to metaphysics. They argued that if existentialist statements had meaning, they should be testable or reducible to verifiable claims about human psychology and behavior. This fundamental clash exemplified the analytic continental divide that would shape much of 20th century European philosophy. The Frankfurt School. Another contemporary movement was the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, Max Horkheimer, Theodor W. Adorno, Herbert Marcuse. While also rooted in Marxist thought, their approach was more dialectical and less scientifically oriented than Neurath's. They criticized the Enlightenment's overemphasis on instrumental reason, arguing it could become oppressive if left unchecked. Neurath, though politically radical, believed scientific planning was inherently emancipatory, indicating a philosophical gap with the Frankfurt School's suspicion of positivism. Hence, the Vienna Circle stood at the intersection of multiple philosophical crosscurrents, but charted its own distinct path grounded in logic and empirical science. Third, specific philosophical debates that emerged posthumously. The realism versus anti-realism debate. Later philosophers questioned the Circle's stance on scientific theories. Do theories aim to truly describe reality, or are they just useful instruments for organizing observations? The Circle's official line was often ambiguous. Schlick sometimes spoke of correspondence with reality, suggesting a mild realism. Carnap advocated instrumentalist or if-thenist interpretations, especially for theoretical terms. Post-Circle philosophers, such as Bas van Fraassen with his constructive empiricism, extended this discussion, arguing that theories need only be empirically adequate without necessarily describing an underlying reality. This debate continues to revolve around issues the Circle first highlighted: how to interpret the status of unobservable entities like electrons, quarks, or black holes. The mind-body problem. Herbert Feigel's work on the identity theory of mind influenced philosophers like J.J.C. Smart and U.T. Place. The Circle's physicalism laid the groundwork for seeing mental states as brain states, or at least describing them in physical terms. Subsequent debates in consciousness studies, functionalism, and eliminative materialism can be seen as extensions of the Circle's physicalist impetus. Confirmation theory and Bayesianism. Carnap attempted to formalize the idea of confirmation, leading eventually to Bayesian approaches in philosophy of science. The challenge was how to assign probabilities to hypotheses and update them given new evidence. This line of research evolved throughout the second half of the 20th century, culminating in a robust Bayesian epistemology. While not all credit goes to the Circle, their early attempts at a rational reconstruction of induction spurred these developments. Fourth, retrospective influence on cognitive science, AI, and related fields. The Vienna Circle's belief in formal languages and logical analysis found resonance in the mid-20th century boom in computer science and artificial intelligence. Logical programming. Early AI researchers like Alan Newell and Herbert Simon were inspired by the possibility of formalizing reasoning. Cognitive science. The emphasis on operational definitions of mental processes parallels the Circle's push for empirical verifiability of theoretical concepts. AI ethics and verification. The question, how do we verify or confirm the outputs of AI systems, can be traced to the Circle's concerns about meaning and testability. Though far removed in time, the Circle's quest for a precise empirical framework for knowledge resonates with challenges in machine learning. How do we interpret the hidden layers of neural networks? In algorithmic fairness, how do we define fairness in terms that can be empirically checked? And in the formal verification of software, how do we ensure a program meets its specification? 5. Conclusion. Assessing the Vienna Circle's lasting meaning. In the grand narrative of philosophical history, the Vienna Circle represents a bridge between 19th century positivism and modern analytic philosophy. a movement that championed an anti-metaphysical stance rooted in scientific inquiry and logic, a symbol of the fragile interplay between reason and the socio-political environment, demonstrating how easily intellectual freedom can be extinguished by violence and oppression. Their work endures in the very vocabulary of contemporary analytic philosophy. Terms like verification, protocol sentence, physicalism, analytic synthetic, and logical form. Even when these concepts are disputed or reformulated, they remain central reference points. The circle's rigorous style of argumentation, its bold dream of a unified science, and its tragic dissolution amidst historical turmoil stand as a testament to both the power and vulnerability of ideas. Final words. The Vienna Circle's story is one of hopeful innovation in a time of crisis. Their weekly meetings, café discussions, and published manifestos carried a burning conviction that humanity could progress by discarding superstition and clarifying its language. They sought to unite across disciplines, languages, and cultures under the banner of scientific reason. While their immediate project founded on the reefs of fascism and internal philosophical challenges, their legacy lives on in the continuing quest to ground our understanding of the world on clear, testable, and logically coherent principles. Though we have spilled many words in recounting their history, this extended narrative being a fraction of the whole story, perhaps the Circle would concur that what truly matters is not the volume of words but their clarity and empirical reference. In that spirit, we conclude with the hope that this expansive account offers both substance and insight into one of the pivotal movements in modern thought.